Yeah, I did the same last year, and I ended up having grades. Don't worry.
I'm gonna talk to Vivek on Friday. I don't know what happened.
Do you want to change it now, or we can just do the code on here since you have that, then we switch over to this for the slides. Okay.
It was a good character building experience. Oh god.
Just have you write proofs out. Is that
I think someone's were talking the proof, and I didn't finish half of it.
Yeah. That's the problem. Yeah. Yeah, the last 20 points is like a very heavy proof. So if you start with that, you end up losing precious time for the rest.
I started that.
That's why it goes in the end, because if you have time, you do it.
That's fair. I should have done that. I did the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I will go over the hover fact solution first. So the part 2 is the scales, access, and copy the list. It should be hard, right? So any question for part 2?
what?
The part 2 is just to create a scale and append access to the goals.
Oh. Okay.
No, my problem started with sorting.
Yeah, so we'll skip that part. And the part 3 is the update table. So it's inside the update table function. So we did the same thing. We select the table body first, and we select all the table rows. And we bound data, data array, we call it table element inside our class. So after that, we select all the table header. So it will append the team's name as the table header. So far so good, right? So after
The team names as the table header.
you can do table the table cell TD. It's the same, but we choose table header. It's just some time.
Okay.
Yeah. So after we bound the data array to each the table rows, we need to also construct the object for each table cell. So you see the TD is the process we do in the last tutorial. So we use the table header and we mapped. We also use the table array, the table elements before. So we just select if k is delta goes. That means we are constructing the object for the first column. So we create a new. So we'll create a new object. It will have the tab and width value attribute. So you can see for delta goals, I just extract the goals made and the goals conceded. That's the only two important value we need for the circles and the rectangular. And the width is ID. We need the width to filter the table cells later. So here, we filter all the bars and we append the rectangular to all the bar, the table cell that the ID is bars. So we do the same thing for all the columns, and we have the table. Any questions so far? Yeah. So that's the part 3. So part 4 is only for graduate students. It's ID games. So yeah. So for TR is all the table rows we have. We add a callback function on click. So on click, it will call the update list function. So I is the index of the click row. It will start from 0 to the table element -1. So when we click on the row, it will call the update list function. Yeah. So at first we need to check if we are clicking on the aggregate row. So we just expand the aggregate row. And we also, like, the next row is to check if we are clicking on the last one on the table row. And then if the next one is a game, we will just remove, like, because we have the games object inside the table row data. So we just remove that, all the games from the table element array. So if it's not game, that means we need to expand the games row. So we add the games row just one by one. So after that, we will have a new table element array, and we call update table again. It will update just automatically. So far so good, right?
Yes.
Yep.
So at the top, sorry, so the if the next row has a game, then you just collapse it. And then,
338, the line number. It is 338.
so what's the first statement of the if statement saying? It's basically saying if the next row is
The first
game.
one should be checked if it's aggregate.
Okay. Yeah. So the first part you're saying, is there an next row that already exists, or what? And then the second if statement you're saying, if it has a game,
Yeah, if the next row is a game. So the next row is the index, like I is the index of the row we are clicking, right?
right?
So the next row is just to to check if we are clicking on the last row of the table element. So if it's the last, the next row will just be the index. So we don't have the next. So we find that if we have the next row, and then we are looking for if the next row is a game type.
And what do you do if it is a game then?
Yeah. So you can see from the line 338. So we check if the next row is a game type. So if it's a game type, we will call the supplies here. So we just add all the games element in the table element array from f plus 1.
Okay.
So if it's not game, that means we need to append more objects of our game, right? So we just add the game array one by one.
Okay.
Make sense? So then the next part is the sorting. So for sorting, like we also need to add a callback function for the table headers. So we select all the table headers and we call onClick. And onClick, it will just call another function. So the function process is like we need to construct the table element array first. So we saw the table element we have now based on what we click. So from line 98 to just like 122, it's just like how we sort the element inside the array. And after that, we need to call the collapse list. So it's just simple that we just remove all the objects that have the type game. You can do it first. You can remove game first and sort it later. So we can also sort it first and remove it later. It's the same thing. So after we got the list, we call update table. Yeah. So all done this work. So any questions? I think you have passed the sorting, right?
Yes, but yeah, I don't have any questions.
Yeah, I think if you if you check the table element is updated properly, like you have the sorting element there, but the table is not updating properly. That problem is like most possible from the update table. Yeah, you may.
I spent several hours, I think, in the same position that Alex may have been in, and then I went back and did the interrupted exit, and finally fixed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that turns out that's critical.
It took me like 6 hours.
Yeah, the better way is to separate the old element you select and the enter element, and just to make sure you are clear that which part you need to append with and set attribute to the enter or the old element.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's all for the table. And then for the tray. So at first we create a tray with the size. And we use D3 stratify to extract the root. And after that we call tray, it's like a function. And we pass the root in. And yeah, so then we select the tray, we append a link, append node. Yeah, that's all. It should be straightforward, right? Questions? No? Cool. Yeah. So the last part is just like interactions. We append the mouse over mouse dot callback function for all the table rows. And in mouse over, we update the tray. So inside update tray, we just highlight all the links we want. Yeah, we select all the links we want out and just highlight it. And when the mouse over, we clear all the clause we highlighted for. Yeah, that's it. Any questions on number 5?
Probably fell asleep. It's gonna be on that side. Other side. Right.
So we're going to go over different principles that are going to be helpful in homework 6. Starting with map, as a reminder. Do you guys remember what map does?
It's like a for each function that returns an array. Do functions.
Yes. What's the I guess what makes it different from for each?
Returns an array.
So it makes a copy, like it copies the array. So it's a modified copy version of the array. So this is going to be helpful.
Yes, you can ask questions. Minus what this is for.
My question is like filter versus map. I know they're probably like two completely separate things, but could you guys just like, so map is like a for each loop that has a return in it, right?
Yeah.
And then a filter is what? Like,
So a filter is similar. So I guess
It's different. So think about it this way. What map does is map goes through every element and returns some value, right? Filter is going to return a subset of the original values.
Right.
Right? So that would be the same as calling, say, map, where D returns just D here. But only in specific cases. In what cases? In the cases where you decide that D maps to true. If D maps to true rather than to false, then the original data value D gets returned as a mapped array. But because it's always going to be a subset, because not necessarily all of them will return true.
So like rather than is filter then oftentimes used to like instead of putting like if statements in that like in your arrow function with D, like is that used to? Like,
Yeah, you can
would
do
that
that.
make that simpler basically?
Yep. So rather than using if statements, you can filter things according to a specific condition and just do stuff on those objects.
So for, I guess, a situation that you would use filter instead of map. So if you were, one of our previous homeworks, we used map, but we were returning some of the values were null because we had an if statement. So you don't modify with filter, you're checking to see if the value is what you want it to be. So you'd be like filter, so you have an array of like even and odd numbers, and you want to filter to make sure that it's even. So you just want evens. It's like you're just going to get an array.
Cool. All right. Then I appreciate that.
For homework 5, you could have also used it as a way of separating your game rows from your aggregate rows for your goal view, right? You could have said, okay, well, I've got all of my data here. Some number of these table elements are game rows, some are aggregate rows. I know that for every single one, we're going to append cells, but after that, some of these are going to look one way and some of these have to look another way. So I can take the subset of them that look one way and do stuff on that selection, and filter for the subset that do the other way and do stuff on that selection and make them completely separate.
Okay. Thank you.
If you want to like manipulate, generally with map, you're going to be returning to maybe create like a new map array, like new, basically like a new copy variable. But if you want to just modify the array and not return a new array, you can just use filters.
Yep.
So D3 brushes, you're going to be using D3 brushes for homework 6, specifically brush X. But basically, you have your choice. There's 2D brushes and a 1D brush. For this, you would be using a one-dimensional brush along the x-axis because you want to select states within a certain range for user input. So elements that you're going to need for a brush, basically, you're going to specify an extent. So it determines the size of this. Basically, you create a group when you're creating a brush, and you call just like an axis, or like a D3 axis. You create a group for the brush, and then you call from, like in your group selection, you're going to call your brush on that. That makes sense. Similar to you call the axis on your axis group. But you're going to specify an extent, which is an invisible overlay, and kind of constrains the brush selection. So you can only brush and select within a given bounding box. That takes, as well with the 1D brush, it takes the first initial like x0, y0, x1, y1. So x0, y0 is going to be top left, and then x1, y1 is going to be bottom right. And you're all on your selections. Like I said, you're going to call brush. So you can do this by create your, you can do it, I guess, multiple ways, but a nice clean way to do it is you have your brush variable, D3 brush x for the extent, and determine what on event you want, calling your brush function, and then you call that brush on your group that you've determined your brush. So an on event, you can do basically trigger a function on brush start, during the brush, or on brush end. So that's when you're drawing your selection. And we can see it in action. this overlay, when you go over, basically within the extent, you get a little crosshair there, and then you can draw along that. And right now we're just console logging. There's two things. So I should have made a slide for this, but what you're going to be using is you can assign your given scale and associate that with your brush. So when you make a brush selection, you'll get information on the pixel range, and then you can also invert that to get the scale, the brush selection scale to your domain. So see here.
Can you just scale the output of the brush then, or can you scale the area on which the brush is measured?
You can do it multiple ways. I think it's, for me at least, it's simple to just take, so when you, this event selection is basically capturing the pixel, like the pixel selection. And so you can use, basically X is our scale, so we're setting the scale based on the range and then the domain that we have for whatever axis that we're brushing. And then you can just go, this variable X is your scale, right? You basically take that scale, invert it, and then pass the selection as a parameter, and that just converts your pixels and scales them to be like the selection that you want to be data. So this selection, this event.selection is basically like an array of two values. You get the start and stop value. So when you're inverting, you just basically the event selection the first index and then the second element, just to specify your start and stop. And that's going to be helpful.
Can you show me the output, the brush example, yes. Well, what's the brush there?
So
The brush
this
is that gray thing.
That's the selection. Yeah, the selection. So basically, like, you can't really so you can make a brush with handles, but for this specific example, maybe because in your homework it's not really it's kind of invisible until you select something and then you get a gray overlay. But basically, the brush is defined by anywhere that you get this crosshair, and we're getting a little overlap right here, but we've defined the extent of our brush. And it looks like it's it keeps going right here. So it looks like it just kind of carries across this entire thing. So we are able to brush here, which doesn't make much sense, but little bug there. But yeah, basically you can select anywhere in this extent, and it's determining what so it gives you the pixel range. You get it that this is information directly from the event selection. So 86 to 261, and then by using the scale that you have for your axis, you can just invert that. So you take the scale, .invert, and then you just pass this event selection that we call X.
Is there a simple way to get objects that are within your brush selection?
I have to think about that. I should have made that for. Here's what I think of in a simple way.
You just go through and look at kind of the bounding box of your objects and see whether or not they're in the extent, or is there a smarter way of handling that?
I guess you can probably do that. The only thing that I've selected, thinking like a hair over a lot, I was selecting based on the data. So I'm trying to think of if you had data that was determining where it was along the axis, it would probably be the most efficient way to select. So whatever you're scaling, whatever you're using to place your objects along the x-axis, I would filter the data based on the brush selection from based on whatever variable you're using from your data.
So invert.
Yeah.
Is that a JavaScript function or T3?
T2 scaling. I'm like 99.9% sure, but we definitely looked it up.
So basically, like it takes two values, at least for a 1D brush like this, the starting value and the end value, and it knows that it's connected to that X scale up there basically because of X,
So,
right? Because X is already scaled.
basically like, so if you think about scales, it's basically like an efficient way to
It's a
decrease.
map
Yeah.
from your domain to a range, right? So you have one set of things, and it's a function that maps from that set of things to another set of things,
Yeah.
right? Inverse is simply saying, okay, instead of going from domain to range, I'm going to go from range to domain, right? So the domain to range was data to pixel space. As soon as you have a function that maps one direction like that, you can invert that function to get the opposite relationship.
So it's inverting from whatever
Domain, it's inverting from range to
range to domain. Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you're using scales for data, you're converting the, like basically data values from the domain of like the range of your data. Basically mixes back. So we're not really like technically assigning the scales to the brush, we're just using that brush like scale.
We're using think about it this way. The scale itself maps from domain to range, which is data space to pixel space. The brush extent is defined in pixel space and returns subsets of pixel space. So then you can get the equivalent subset of domain space by taking that subset of pixel space and using the inverse of your scale to return the equivalent subset in domain space.
We'll post this code pen example for reference. Like that. So, does that make sense to everyone?
All right. So this bit is something that you don't necessarily need to know how to do. At the same time, I am well aware that in the version of the homework that went out, there is CSS stuff that you can use in there that will get you part of the way, and we have never talked about this. So we're going to cover it and also cover, like, you can feel free to ignore most of what we're about to talk about, but if you do so, there are a couple of things you need to be aware of. So we'll cover both of those things. All right? So, loosely, we have something, and we'll just change the view here to full page. Okay, so say we're looking at something that's about this big, right? What we have here in terms of our underlying data, go back to our editor view. Of course, these are. Okay. Divs. We've got 4 divs in a row here, defining each of our charts. 2 of them we've labeled sub-content, 1 of them we've labeled side, 1 of them we've labeled main content, and equivalently, within our CSS, we've got kind of percentage definitions where main content is going to take up 70. It's slightly less than 75%, just so you don't wind up with percentage overlaps. Slightly half of that for sub-content. Side content is about 25%. And what you wind up with then, as a result, is a series of charts that, when we zoom out here, take up approximately 75%. And so this is about kind of where pixel space and those percentages are all lined up in terms of width. And we can see that in terms of the JavaScript here, exactly what we're doing is we've got a function that is going to create a chart on each of these div layers. It's going to create it with this width, this height, and append a rectangle that has this color in it, right? So here's that create chart function. Selecting the chart, we're adding a class for the chart just so that the rect displays correctly. We'll note that we've defined the chart rect to have a specific stroke and fill, and we're going to override the fill on each element. We're just taking the width and the height directly, using a basic data bind just to make sure that we're not reaccessing elements here. We're selecting our SVG and appending it, setting a width and a height, as we've done in most things, selecting a rect and appending that to the SVG, and setting a width, the height, and the color, right? So this should all be fairly straightforward in terms of what you're doing. And the code is set up such that you get something and you can use kind of a side chart class and subclasses and things in the CSS that will do something like this. The downside of the problem with just doing that sort of naive implementation is that note as we resize this stuff, things stack on top of one another in ways that we weren't necessarily expecting them to, which could become a problem. So how do we fix this? Well, there are two things that you can do. One of them is to not use relative layouts the way we are in kind of those CSS classes that are defined. Instead, you're going to use absolute positions, make sure that your divs and your SVGs all have defined widths, and you can handle your layout manually that way if you want to. Alternatively, if you want to use classes like this, there's two different solutions we can kind of, simple solutions to change this very basic example into something that is more responsive. So the first thing we're going to do is to basically cause the SVG containers that are defined in so where this says width 74%, 36%, 25%, right? And we'll zoom in so that we can actually see this. What we're going to do is we're actually going to make sure that our actual elements on the page are each taking up exactly that based on the page width. So, how do you go about doing that? Well, instead of simply setting the width and the height to be naively the width and the height that you originally defined here, in our case 600 by 300, instead what we're going to do is we're going to scale our width and our height according to the content box for the div, which has a width of, in this case for main content, 74% of the page, right? So if we're going to scale that, what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to kind of use the aspect ratio of our original SVG, which in this case 600 pixels wide, 300 pixels tall. So we want it to be always twice as wide as it is tall, right? We take that aspect ratio. In this case, we did height over width. This only matters in terms of whether or not you're doing a multiply or divide with your aspect ratio. So we're doing height over width. So this is 0.5. And we are going to grab the target width of the bounding box, which is our div. So the div in the CSS, if we look back over here, is going to take this page width, and the div is going to have a width that is defined as 74.25% times the overall page width. You can access that from the div by taking the div selection, getting the original node. So now we're in kind of DOM API land. And within the DOM API, you can use this call, which is get bounding client rectangle, to get the bounds of that particular element within the page. So this is going to actually return the kind of width that is 75% of your page width. and you can access it from that bounding rectangle using width. So then to get the equivalent height using our aspect ratio of height over width, what we're doing is we're taking kind of height divided by width times target width, canceling out the kind of width aspects to get target height. So target width times aspect ratio should be our target height. And now we know that target width and target height will have the exact same aspect ratio as our original width and height. And so if all we do is change that, then we have something that, let's go with that, change view, full page. We have something that looks like this. We scale it down here, we refresh our page, and everything matches to what we want. Right? So at this point, you know that if you were to load this up at a given page, all of your boxes are going to exist there, filling up those percentages with the same aspect ratios that you originally set up. So you can kind of create your SVG and do all of the stuff internally using kind of these target widths and heights, and everything should scale and look okay. The other thing we can do is we can actually make this responsive. And what that means is that as I move this, it's going to continue to scale automatically. Now, if you do that, the actual SVG is going to scale, right? So if you have a font that is defined at a particular size, that entire font is going to scale downward. It is going to just use the direct scaling of the vector graphics. It is not going to allow you to redraw and use more space in the same way that kind of redrawing with a new target height and target width will. However, it can be useful in certain cases. In some of your plots, you may not necessarily care. The things may be large enough that you want to toss this in. So we're going to explain exactly how you would go about doing this.
So you're saying, wait, text would scale? Okay, 'cause
So
like in like Visio or something, if you have something.
Another way of thinking about this is we are currently within the CSS defining a stroke width around the edge of each of these boxes that's 3 pixels. Now, right now, this is 3 pixels in like 1600. Very small, very difficult to read. At this size, it's 3 pixels out of, what, 600, right? If you were to create your chart at this size and scale it up with responsive, well, now we're at 1200. Each of those is going to be 6 pixels wide in the responsive mode. We'll actually see this and we'll run an example. To make your code responsive, if you want to do this, there are 2 key SVG attributes you need to know about. They are viewbox and preserve aspect ratio. Basically, what is going to happen is instead of setting a width and a height on your SVG, you are not going to set a width and a height. In fact, you need to not set a width and a height. Instead, what you do is you set an aspect ratio for the SVG object. That's defined by viewbox here. And a way for the SVG to preserve that aspect ratio according to the container that it's in. Right? So what happens here is viewbox takes kind of, in the same way you think about the SVG space, right? It takes your upper right-hand corner and your width and your height to define this box. And that's going to create kind of, in the same way that we calculated an aspect ratio, it's going to hold an aspect ratio on the back end. What preserve aspect ratio as an attribute does is it says if the aspect ratio of the container that the SVG object is in is insufficient to display the SVG object, here's what I do. There's a long list of different versions you can use. This is the one I would recommend, because what this is going to do is it's going to equally scale x and y, respectively, and make sure that the middle of the SVG object scaled is the middle of the container. So it's just going to scale the entire SVG object down and make sure it's centered in the container until it fits. There are other ones you can use, but that's the one we'll be using in the example. Right? So, assuming you've set those, how you go about making the SVG responsive is make sure you've set the viewbox and preserve aspect ratio. You make sure it doesn't have a height and a width. And you make sure that the SVG itself has CSS that puts the position as absolute and creates top left as being kind of your 0 in the container. And you set the display to inline block, which means it's going to inline in terms of the container, fill the container, be right. The parent container, which in most cases is going to be some sort of div, you need to make sure it can actually have kind of whatever position it wants. Usually in our cases, because we're doing things that are moving around, we want a relative position, and we want these things to be inline blocks so that multiple of them can actually be next to each other in the page. That's what kind of the inline block display feature here in CSS means. What you have to do for the parent container is set the width as whatever percentage you want, and you need to set this padding bottom attribute. Because basically what's going on is we haven't set a width and a height for our SVG, right? And we're setting this so that it takes up the space of whatever container it's in, which in this case is a container that has width defined. So the width is going to get defined, but we still have no height that's defined. So if you don't have padding bottom set to the aspect ratio, no height, you're not going to get nothing displayed, right? It's just going to look like there's nothing there in the div. So what you're doing is you're adding padding that is your SVG aspect ratio times whatever width you're using here, right? Now, in most cases, if you're just adding your own secondary div, that's going to be 100%. You use the SVG aspect ratio, it'll be fine. And so let's see how that works. We've got our aspect ratio, our original width, and our height. Instead of simply using the original div, right now we're going to append a new div and class it SVG container. This SVG container is kind of that inline block, relative position, 100% width. So that's taking up 100% of the parent container, which is each of kind of either sub-content, side content, whatever we set over here for the class. And we are going to make sure that that div has the padding bottom that is set based on the relevant aspect ratio for each chart. So aspect in this case is a percentage or a fraction. It's going to be like 0.05, given that we're doing, for this one's 300 over 600, right? So it's 0.05. We need that to say 50%. So that is exactly, basically, you multiply times 100 and add a percentage here. And what was the other thing we needed? We needed to make sure that we updated our SVG so that it doesn't have a width and a height, and instead has preserved aspect ratio. It has a view box that is defined by our original SVG height width, the unscaled version, and we've set the class to have the relevant portions of SVG content responsive here. And note that when we did that, everything automatically filled in and scaled properly. And now you've got something that does this, which is fancy and nice. the scaling issue, if we want to illustrate it, however, let's scale things down to where it pretty much breaks. Reload the site. Save it, so I just need to comment this stuff out again. If we did have text inside of those, you would see that it would be scaling along with the size of the box. So just something to be aware of. That being said, we did all of that by appending a secondary div, right? If we look at what's going on here, this is going to be a pain in the ass to get to, but page wrapper, boxes, output container, results, iframe, and here's our original document object. Yeah, I know. We don't need the header, we need the body, right? What we've done is we've created inside our original chart div a header, and now we've got a div that's handling the container and preserved aspect ratio here. Now what if you wanted to just use the original div that you have for each of these things, rather than append one to kind of populate the namespace? You can totally do this, but you just need to be careful about ensuring that your aspect ratio is correct in the final case. So note that if we were to just comment this out and do padding bottom here, we've got a lot more padding than we were necessarily expecting here, right? And this is because this is simply using the aspect ratio, whereas if we recall back over here, our aspect ratio is assumed to be multiplied by whatever width percentage we're using here, which if we were to look at, say, our sub-content boxes, which are chart 1 and another chart here, those sub-content boxes are 36.75% of the page width. So we are 50 times 36.75, which if we do this, 0.5 times 36.75, our padding should be like 18.3, and instead it's 50, right? Which is why you're getting a serious amount of padding here between those charts and the underlying chart below. So how do we fix that? Well, we need to get the original parent width. Basically, we need to get this percentage value, right? This percentage value is defined as 36.75% of the width of whatever the parent of this, the div that is class subcontent is. In this case, that's our HTML page. It's our body element, right? But loosely, it's always going to be the parent, and you know it's always going to be the parent. So you can get the parent width by taking your selection, returning the parent node, and selecting that. So you get a D3 selection of the parent object right here, and doing the exact same thing we did before of grab the node for the parent object, get the bounding client rectangle, get the width, and you now have the width of whatever that parent object was. You can get the equivalent percentage width defined in the CSS by then dividing kind of the width of my current content box by the parent width. That should return the exact percentage you have here. And now we're going to set our padding bottom to be the aspect times that percentage width. Again, because each of these are fractions, we still need the 100% multiplier to make sure that the CSS renders correctly over here. But at this point, now you have everything scaling, and you're just going ahead and using the original divs that are there with their percentages. Okay? So, not that difficult, as long as you're keeping track of exactly what your aspect ratio is in relation to your parent container and making sure you've got your CSS set correctly. There is code that will get you part of the way there for a layout if you want to do this in the homework, which is why we're talking about it. You are not necessarily required to do so, but if you just start using some of the classes that are in there, some of the stuff is set up to do this, and you may start getting scaling behaviors you weren't anticipating. So at this point, hopefully, you now have, and this is kind of linked on the slides, so you can access all of this, play with it, figure it out. This should be relatively all of the various pieces and how they were used for a version of the homework solution, that if things aren't quite working the way you're expecting them to, you have a way of going back, looking at what was done here, and using that to figure out what you might or might not need to change in the homework code in order to get the behaviors to work the way you want or not be behaving the way you're not expecting them to. Does that make sense? Okay. Cool. So I think that's it. That's all we got. Unless you guys have other specific questions in relation to the homework that you want to talk through. Yeah.
I guess for the line, in the homework there's like a line connecting all the years with dots along it. I was wondering if you could put that in.
In the year plot, the original line.
Yeah, so you're asking the question is.
Little circles, in between the larger circles for like each year.
Yeah, it's just a D3 line. So you have to specify just kind of like the expect actually for brush, just the x0, y0, and then x1, y1. But we just, because you're not binding data to it, you just need to append the D3 line to like before you append your circles. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
And then the dotted location is actually in class. I think it's mirror chart. Pretty sure it's mirror chart.
It should be it's a class within which I'm sure there is some stroke CSS selector that's defining it. So. Yeah.
I have a question about the color scale. So we're supposed to use it in the electoral votes at least, on the electoral votes.
Yes.
The question I have though is, these values, the domain maps from -60 to +60.
Yep.
But Democrats have, I believe, at least -88 for one of their years. So is that going to screw things up?
I believe the scale will just move to using it'll default to the maximum that it can
Okay.
within the scale. If there's a value outside the range of the D3 scale, doesn't clamp it.
Is it divergent scale? What was the?
Is that quantile scale?
I'm not actually sure. If you use like scale linear and you have like a value that isn't in your scale, like if it's like beyond, it'll just try to like basically interpolate it. It'll try to like map it. But if you do clamp, so if you say like scale linear, and on your scale you clamp true, it is going to max out on the max domain. So
But it's a qualitative
yeah, and that's why
anyway.
I'm wondering if it maybe like I don't know if it'll actually. I would say like maybe it just goes.
So by line, do you mean hat with the line function? Or what? I don't know what this
so-
D3 line is.
I believe in the very first one, in the very first assignment, or I'm sorry, the very second assignment, because the very first assignment was a survey. Before we introduced path, had you draw a equivalent path chart with actual line objects. You should be using that same line object. I mean, you could define it as a path with 2 points, and that's fine, but I believe there is actually a D3 line function for singular line objects that we used in homework 1.
Oh, we didn't use D3. Yeah, I guess lines.
Yeah, so if there's a SVG line object, you can D3 append line and set the attributes accordingly.
And you just set the class to be line charts in the comments.
Lines. Oh,
So the line 79,
Since
Yeah.
when we call like a literal flow chart, it's just like when we did our map calls, it's just like map.update plot and then you pass whatever the parameters are for that class.
I believe so.
I'm talking about like, so we select a year, and that year selection is supposed to drive the updates for the other charts.
Yes.
So for like electoral vote chart, it'll just be electoral vote chart dot update, and then whatever the parameters are.
Yep. And provided that the electoral vote chart has been initialized and exists, then it should just update.
We pass,
Then you
when we pass the color scale, it's not color scale without calling the function.
So the color scale itself should be defined as a function, which you can pass like any other object, right? JavaScript functions, you can create the arrow, you can say let anonymous function equal, and now you've got a variable that's a function. So as long as you're the same way that you would access the function, if it's set up as this, I didn't actually write this homework assignment, so if it's set up as this, then whatever, then you should be able to use this whatever and pass that as the variable, and that will get passed by reference.
I have a question about setup the class. So there's like DAW attribute. So there's actually 2 ways to set up the class. So DAW attribute class and DAW class.
Have to change.
I'm understanding the class, so like just what I kind of when I try to just set this whole thing
It
as
just changed when I like pulled it from, you
So
know.
how do I set up?
Class,
And I don't
Is there any way to set up?
Scroll up.
Input a function there and return on that.
Because you said we can deselect too, where you selected deselect. Yeah, and added, but it makes it bigger and removes the text out. Just trying to change the color of the text to white, but yeah, it's tricky. I had to do like these guys
It's a column on my
your text.
When I do this,
I
see this class.
Oh my god.
This whole
So-
thing.
yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah.
Oh,
I am not sure off the top of my head.
I had someone show me that last.
Let me look.
Click and then the last, so you can deselect. Yeah, they call it. I don't know. So.
Okay, well, let's
whatever,
find out
like,
this
2
is,
before I leave here, it's gonna trigger the
uh,
so this thing takes a lot of time. Yeah. And I can't tell I have this electoral vote chart update. So Sam mentioned it had to be initialized. Is this in your chart? Your chart. Yeah. So at the bottom. Yeah, at the bottom.
It says, election information corresponding to that year should be loaded in paths as updated under visualization.
So that's what you're saying? Yeah, that's what I would want to make sure I got it. And I don't think it's not working right now. So.
to call something,
It's just got, right. Sam mentioned it had to be initialized, so I did. So I just got whatever.
Yeah, so it looks like the documentation is such that class doesn't work that way, it doesn't have data bounds.
Just update the box.
Do you need to do like
But
a
it will override
one
the
enclosed
So
remembering
Well, so if I, so here's the trick.
if yes,
To the go-to.
Cool.
will overwrite.
So, that's a lot
the original.
Yeah, it'll overwrite the original class of theirs. It doesn't overwrite every other class variable that you
So-
set.
And
But
then
if
they
there
call
is an
function.
original class that has been set, that will get overwritten.
Someone did.
So what's the, I guess, where are you having problems?
I call it here. I assume it was.
That is the, so this
Okay,
is
so
defining
did you figure out the
color
line?
scale
Yeah.
that you can use that will take values from this domain, -16, whatever, which is going to be the electoral vote percentages, and it's going to map and return colors, and you'll use this for the electoral votes. It's for this one and this one, and it's that scale that you're seeing right over there.
Oh, I tried something else. The main one to just show us all the visualizations using some solutions.
Yes, we have not, so none of the homework solutions have definitive extra credit solutions implemented for them. If you implemented the extra credit and it's working, we're going to give you credit for it. That's basically how we're handling that. Yep.
This one's stupid, but,
Yeah.
am I using Apple?
I have actually maybe like
Styles, right?
maybe
Okay.
So number one is my SVG is currently not the full width of the div that it's contained in. So it's really
So
so does that, do I need to like fit it out like we were talking about? Like, or
as long as
because this is, because the SVG is set to be the, and I'm sorry, it's always really small on my computer, but it does that get mounting client and stays out there, margins and stuff. So I'm assuming it's okay, but if the div goes out there, why
isn't it?
Yeah.
Add this here.
Click back over here and click just refresh for me. I want to make sure it doesn't just pop.
so it's just pop.
It went from here to here, so it's not the full, but it's significantly longer.
You know what might be a good.
So your SVG now is the same as the div, right? If we look at each of these, you can see the widths right here in this top corner, right? So this is 7, 92,
22, so that's probably just the difference between the
road
or whatever setups. Okay, I have another question for you. Okay, when I am calling, so like I made groups for each of these. I try to do it the proper way.
Yeah,
It's right.
It's kind of like backtracking, like, okay, this isn't working.
So if I'm trying to access, I have this set of elements, but I want to access here. Right, so I was able to access that, say for example to get this text here. I was able to access that doing like D and then like bracket, like so array position here. Why can't I just do D dot
it is object. In theory, I think you can,
So, if
but it would need to make sure it's all uppercase exactly like that.
it should console log all the codes.
Okay.
So let's see. How many do we have in common? A lot, but
Yeah, so it probably, so if you use the dot syntax, it needs to match that string exactly, right? And so if you did like year in lowercase or upper Y year in lowercase rest of the year, it's not gonna match it, it's gonna come back like it doesn't work.
Okay, so now we're okay. So because that just makes way more sense to me.
Uh-huh.
And then the final question I had was, we have this, basically we can like click and everything.
Uh-huh.
I just wanted to ask about the kind of these instructions down here at the bottom. So election information corresponding to the year that you should be loaded and passed to okay, build other visualizations build, and also make them initialize from the get-go.
Yeah, so that's a reference to the fact that like right now, right, like each of these is going to call update electoral votes chart, update popular vote chart with kind of that CSV data that you just loaded in, right? The question is, if we reload this and you selected nothing, what content is in electoral votes? What's in brush selection? What does each of those look like? I mean, they could just be blank boxes that nothing fills until you click on this, or you could set it to be some random year so that you have content updating automatically. It doesn't matter for us, but the reference solution did contain initial data on load, and as I was looking
It's
through
like
stuff,
setting like this dot active year to 2000 for that one.
yes,
Yeah.
it's basically setting an initial year that's going to create an initial state, and loading the data for that initial state, rather than kind of waiting for it to be on-click selection.
Okay. So Alex made a little headway in this area, but I'm a little confused. Like the whole like data between different like classes and different like that just like confuses the hell out of me. So
So what should happen is you should have some sort of function, and I don't have a marker right now. I have one. So loosely, your year plot, right, is an object, right? And in addition to the year plot object, there should be an initialized created kind of all of the other objects. And I believe in script, if we just open up script and look at script, we can see all of this happening.
yeah, there's like a new title chart, new vote percentage chart.
And each of those is passed into like the year plot, the year chart, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we create a vote percentage chart, we create a tile chart, we create a shift chart, we create an electoral vote chart, and then the year chart is created with references to each of those objects. So if we open up year chart now, we go to the create the constructor at the very top, right? It says this year chart is electoral vote chart, tile chart, etc. So right now, you've got something that looks like this. You've got each of these charts, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this is the year chart here. But this has accessing elements to all 4 of these guys, right? As this dot, whatever the name of the chart object is that's up there in the constructor. So, when we have something in here that behaves on click, right? So for elements up here on click, we are going to grab the associated data element, get the year, which you just did for creating the thing, and based on that year and all that information, we are going to do some sort of CSV load to get data. And we're going to curate that data to however we need to be able to, I believe it's just loading it in, but I have to double check and load. You're going to load your CSV in to get this data, and now you want to update all 4 of these charts with that data. So what you're going to do is each of these charts has already been initialized, they've already been created, they just need to call update with the associated data to change their visualization accordingly. So then after loading the CSV, you're going to call update on each of those things. And so you'll have something like this dot electoral votes chart. Assume this is like let data equals something, which is loading your CSV. It's going to be a promise that you're going to be returning, right? So it's actually, this entire thing is going to be in some sort of asynchronous function in order for that to work. But assuming that, let's actually write this down and see. So we're going to have some sort of d3.csv here, and we can say, I think it's let data is equal to await d3 CSV. Of course, that would need to be in an asynchronous function, so the easiest way of doing this is probably to just use the direct promise. So that's going to be something like d3.csv with some load parameters, and then you're going to have this is going to return the promise, and the promise has, I forget what the exact syntax for the success case is versus the failure case, but you're going to have some sort of success case function here wherein you will have access to the data on which you can now call this dot electoral chart update with the data. And you can do that for each of your 3 charts.
And that's something that would need to be in that on-click.
So because onClick can be defined here, you could technically take this entire thing out and create a function out here. And that function is just going to be...
So the function would run on-click though.
Yes, exactly.
So the
So
function is separate.
you're only needing to load the CSV and shove it to each of those charts after the thing's been clicked, right? Except for potentially in the very first case where you have absolutely nothing, right? So in that case, you can do whatever you want. You can update all of the charts with something, take like some random data load that you want, stick that out here and put it down bottom, and that'll do it. And that was the purpose of that secondary model.